Welcome to Relentless Truth with John Warren, the podcast that extracts truth from a wide range of topics, revealing who God is, who we are, and how we relate to each other. Now, here's John with this week's powerful and practical insights.
Welcome to Relentless Truth. I'm John Warren. It's good to be with you again. Please like, share, review, and subscribe to Relentless Truth. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Or if you'd like, you can go to our website, johnwarrenmedia.com. You can also send along an email to me at john@johnwarrenmedia.com, or feel free to use our contact form on the website. Your encouragement is much appreciated. I receive notes and comments from time to time, and I am grateful that we get to do this work together. I call it work because we talk about important subjects here. We've been talking about some theology, and we're going to go back to that in a couple of weeks. But for the next 2 weeks, I want to talk about the U.S. Constitution, and I'm not going to talk about it in an academic sense. I want to talk about it very practically. My students at Circle Christian School, you've heard me talk about them before. If you've been with me from the beginning, with Relentless Truth from the beginning, you've met some of them. And if you haven't, go to johnwarrenmedia.com, look at the library of episodes and go back to the first 20 or so episodes, and you'll find several interviews that I did with students. Well, every year we have a whole new group of students. My classes are for 11th and 12th graders, and I have some repeat students from year to year because I teach a couple of classes that are only offered every other year. So this year I have a brilliant group of students, and as always, and I wish I could bottle that energy. I wish I could record, which we don't do. Obviously, we have policies against that, our classes. And I wish you, the Relentless Truth listener, could get to know these students and hear them. I will, at the end of the school year, with any graduating seniors, offer them the opportunity to come on the podcast. I'm going to do that again. I didn't do it last year. I did the year before. And I kind of regret that because they are regret not doing it last year, because you just wouldn't believe they would give you confidence in our country. And I don't mean that in a silly way. It's not, I'm not looking to necessarily make them feel good about themselves. You really would feel better about the future of our country if you could spend some time with these amazing young people. Well, we do a thing at this point in the year. We're learning about the U.S. Constitution. We spend a couple weeks on the history and the who was doing what at what time, and where was John Adams, and where was Thomas Jefferson, and we talk about their lives. We get to know Alexander Hamilton and others, key figures. We don't have a lot of time for that, but we really set the stage. And what we learn is that as late as 1775, as late as the summer of 1775, these colonists didn't necessarily want to separate from England. They saw themselves as British citizens. You probably know that. Well, there's a series, and I can't remember, it might be on HBO. A student recommended it to me on John Adams. I want to say it's an 8 or 10 part series, but very good. It will help you, if you don't like to read about history, it will help you learn a little history while being somewhat entertained. But wow, is it historically accurate and really well done. A couple of the actors are well known, and it's produced well, directed well. I think you'd like it. So, having said that, we're right in the middle of the Constitution now. And if you're familiar with Article 1 is about the Congress, the legislature. Article 2 is about the president, the chief executive, and Article 3 about the judiciary. Well, today, I want to talk about Article 1 with you for a few minutes. And again, not in an academic way. I want to see what you know. You might want to take this episode and play a little game with your family or friends. If you're a dork like me, these kinds of things are fun. And these questions I'm going to ask are not designed to trip you up. They're designed to make us think. And in the case of this particular episode, I want us to think about how we absolutely shred the Constitution. By shred, I mean ignore. By shred, I mean disregard. By shred, I mean take authority that doesn't belong to us in the government in various ways. And this isn't one of those right-wing, conspiracy theory whack kind of episodes. This is just real. This is something you could get CNN and Fox News to agree on. This is happening in our country, has been happening. So let's warm up with a couple of easy questions. And I asked my students these questions this week, and I think you'll like this. What is the more perfect union? In order to form a more perfect union is a line from the preamble. What does that mean? More perfect union. In addition to being bad grammar, more perfect, what does it mean? If it's already perfect, English teachers will tell us that, or people who just know how to write, that you don't say more perfect anything. Well, this is a little bit of a political statement, isn't it? It's a reference to the Articles of Confederation. You see, we had just a few years earlier than this 1787 writing and ratifying of the U.S. Constitution. Yes, it was 1787, not 1776. We're in this period where for a couple of years we had this document called the Articles of Confederation. There were several failed attempts to unite us as a country. The Declaration of Independence declared our independence from England, but it was kind of a breakup letter to King George III. It was not really a governing document. And before you cringe and go look it up and get angry at me, look at it. It's got some wonderful tenets of governance over many, many centuries are found in that document. Thomas Jefferson and others, primarily Jefferson, did a great job of writing that document, but it doesn't really describe any kind of union, any kind of country. It just says that it uses the term these United States, but it doesn't talk about how they're to be united. So along come the Articles of Confederation, and they're supposed to accomplish this. And in this particular time with these 13 states, you kind of, and with a lot of, radical change, this, if you run a company or an organization, sometimes you have to take baby steps, and that's what they did. The Articles of Confederation were a means to the end. It's a fun study if you're interested in that kind of thing. You can kind of see the baby steps if you read the Articles of Confederation. So this notion of federalism, that is combining these states. Don't let federalism trouble you. It's just combining the states with maintaining states' rights, but also having a united states, a federal government, a federation, a group effort. And the Articles of Confederation attempted this, but they did not address a very important matter. That matter is funding. That matter is money. That matter is taxation. So here we have this union, and it's kind of described, and the Articles of Confederation are very helpful. They're written by many of the same smart men who ended up writing the Constitution, but they don't address money. They don't really address taxation very well. Now, we're fighting a war, this war for independence, and we had to congeal around that. And then along comes a guy named Alexander Hamilton, and you might have seen Hamilton, the musical, or you might have read about Alexander Hamilton. Brilliant guy, apparently, and feisty, and kind of, in my humble opinion, never met a loan he didn't want the government to make. And he comes up with this plan. And he had some help from James Madison, and if I start naming names, I'll leave your favorite out. But Jay, Madison, Adams, Jefferson, Washington, and some others who aren't as well known, like Jacob Chalice and others come to mind. But it's funny because Hamilton sort of did a circuit where he went to the colonies, the 13 states, and he cut deals. And what he basically said is, we will take on the debt of the states. The federal government will take on the debt of the states. Well, that was very appealing to some states because they had some debt from the war. And, it's like I always talk to my students about this. It's like any consortium, it's never quite fair. And I think of I talked about this in class this week. I think of the student loan forgiveness thing. I know lots of former Circle students who suck it up and find a way. And I mean, I'm sure some of them have to take loans to get through college, student loans, but many of them work hard. Their families work hard. They get scholarships. They take dual enrollment courses. You know how this works. You probably do this in your family. And I'm thinking, wow, the federal government's just going to take all this debt and poof, it's going to be gone. Well, that's not fair. You've heard these arguments. But that's not fair to the student who went to trade school to become an electrician or a plumber or paid their own way. What do they get? They get nothing. So I just don't like the idea of the government doing that kind of thing. And if you study history, Alexander Hamilton, I'm not blaming him for everything that has gone wrong with debt in our country, but he started the first central bank, and he certainly liked this notion of federal spending and federal debt. And taking on the debt of the states didn't bother him one bit. Read the Federalist Papers, and you'll get an idea of why Patrick Henry objected so much. Patrick Henry said he smelled a rat and refused to be a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. Well, this notion of more perfect union is a reference to the Articles of Confederation, and perhaps even, we can't know this, I think, but perhaps even other attempts at the unification of the country, other attempts at federalism. There were several. There was an Albany, New York Congress, and King George assembled it, and Ben Franklin ended up using it as a kind of an organizing tool for the colonies. And there were other efforts along the way that you're probably familiar with. But this notion of more perfect union is interesting. Well, that's just a fun little trivia fact, but we need to get into the weeds here. Let's try this one. What is the age and term of office and any other qualifications for serving in the House and the Senate? We have this thing called the bicameral Congress. And adults who don't know Latin, let me tell you what that means. It just means two chambers. We have 435 House members, 100 voting House members, 100 senators, 2 for each state in the Senate. You probably know these things. And the House is divided by population, by districts. We apportion the districts. And Article 1 of the Constitution talks about this. Well, the age to run for the House is 25 years old. The age for the Senate is 30. And there's some other qualifications. You had to have been a U.S. citizen for 7 years to run for the House, 9 for the Senate. And you also have to live in the state that you represent. Now, we all think, well, of course you do. Well, that's because we've grown up in a country where that's true. What if they hadn't done that? What if they hadn't said that? There's another what if in the preamble. What if they hadn't said, and your posterity? What if they hadn't referenced us in that document? It would have died like a lot of other documents after, a generation or two. It's the most enduring national governing document for any state, sovereign state in the world. Is it full of problems, and do we have some offensive, shameful parts of our history? Absolutely, yes. Did 25 of those guys own slaves? Yes, they did. 25 of the 55 or so who attended, 39 of them ended up signing. So a significant number were slave owners. But in any case, 25 years old for the House, 30 for the Senate, and House members serve for 2 years. So they're elected every 2 years. You may not realize that, but they're running for office as soon as they get in office, as soon as they take the oath of office. The Republicans and the Democrats each rent an office building down the street from the Capitol, not far away at all, and they dial for dollars and try to line their pockets, their campaign pockets, so they can run again. They also take advantage of something called franking privilege, which is sending us documents that usually they're just these huge postcards that talk about how wonderful they are while they're in office. Did you know they can do that as long as they're not campaigning technically, and they know they've got teams of lawyers to make these judgment calls. They can do so at the taxpayer's expense. They have a budget. And so senators serve for 6 years, House members for 2, and the Senate terms are staggered so that only a third of the Senate, roughly, is running for election every 2 years. This way, we don't have this wholesale change of the legislative branch every 2 years like we would if, well, we'd have it every 6 years for the Senate and every 2 years for the House. So we live with that change for the House. Well, that came about, that whole House and Senate thing that we've become very comfortable with. And in fact, almost every state, I think there are 2 states who don't have this model implemented at the state house in state government. And this came about because of a great compromise. And there are several compromises, and depending on where you want to split the hair, it's this one is what we would call the bicameral compromise, the one that resulted in 2 chambers. This was a fight between, and I mean a shouting match where delegates threatened to leave and so on, where the large states wanted their representation to be determined by population, and the small states wanted equal representation. And so this bicameral compromise where everybody gets 2 senators and everybody cuts up the 435 House districts, this compromise saved the U.S. Constitution, interestingly. So there's another compromise I want to talk about that is far more sensitive. That one was a mess, and what a brilliant idea. There's a difference. You can read Article 2 of the Constitution and read about the president, and in that article, along with Article 1, in the section that describes the Senate, and that section, I believe, is Section 3 of Article 1. Section 2 of Article 1 describes the House and some other things, but you can read those articles and you see that the Senate has a special relationship with the president. It's called the advice and consent role. And senators think of themselves, and you can read the quotes over the years, they're a more regal body, they're more important for several reasons, but the primary one is, well, they make more money and they serve longer, and there are 2 from each state, and your 2 senators represent your entire state. Those of you in other countries, my apology for all the U.S. references. You might find it interesting, though. But the Senate is more important primarily because of this advice and consent role with the president. The Senate alone can impeach the president and remove him or her from office. The House can vote on impeachment, but then it just gets referred to the Senate. And the Senate actually can remove the president from office with a 2/3 vote. So this other compromise, though, this next one is the 3/5 compromise. And that is referenced, just so you know, because our press loves to talk about this, politicians love to talk about it, but that is really a reference that you will see in Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And it's actually in the 3rd paragraph, and what it says is representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states. So they're talking about representation in Congress, and they're talking about the distribution of tax revenues that go to the federal government and get distributed to the states. And this is written at a level where everybody can read it and understand it. Most everybody. And anyway, it says according to their respective numbers. So they're talking about the population of the states. But they go on and get themselves in a bit of trouble here. Here's what it says, and then I'll tell you how they got there. Which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, so the white people, including women, although women couldn't vote and weren't part of the Constitutional Convention. And then there's a comma, and it says, including those bound to service for a term of years. And then there's another comma, and excluding Indians not taxed. And another comma, 3/5 of all other persons. So here's what we need to talk about today to address this section well. This is the 3/5 compromise, is what it's called. And you will hear some in the media who take an activist position on one political side or the other, who will say what a disgrace it is that we reference slaves, that's who we're talking about when we say others, as 3/5 of a person. And I agree, that is shameful and it is a disgrace. But it's not what you think it is. You see, this 3/5 compromise was a battle between the slave states and the non-slave states. You can imagine, since we're talking about the apportionment of money and Congress seats, that the slave states wanted to count slaves in this, that we're describing the U.S. Census is what we're describing, and the Constitution goes on. I stopped reading just for the sake of time, but it goes on in that section to describe the census being taken in 3 years from the date of the Constitution, and then every 10 years thereafter. So on the decade, our next one will be 2030, we will have a census, God willing. That is the plan. That is what is prescribed in the Constitution. So that's when we count the people. Now, this requirement, this 3/5 requirement, has been changed by an amendment. It's been addressed by a couple of amendments, actually. And so this is no longer the way we do this. Obviously, we don't have slaves either, but it's important to talk about this. The free states, the non-slave states, wanted to emancipate the slaves, didn't they? You know that. They saw slavery as horrible. The slave states considered slaves, actual people from Africa for the most part, to be property and not humans. So let's get that straight. That was going on in our country. However, the slave states wanted to count the slaves as whole people. So this Constitution, had they had their way, would not have this controversial 3/5 provision. There would have been no compromise. It would have just said, and adding others, not 3/5 of others. And there's some today who get all wrapped around their axle when they talk about this, as if our founders set out to evaluate slaves as 3/5 of a person. The slave states valued them at 0. It's important to know that. The non-slave states valued them as people. However, in this battle, they did not want to count the slaves for apportionment of monies, tax monies, and congressional seats. Neither would you or I, had we been involved at this time. You know why? Because they would have thereby been supporting slavery. Isn't that something? So the non-slave, the free states, the states who wanted to emancipate the slaves and recognize them as people, didn't want to count them in the census as long as they were slaves, because they did not want to endorse or perpetuate slavery. Of course they didn't. And so this great compromise was driven by slave states saying we want to get as much credit for them as possible. And so that's where this 3/5 compromise came from. And I thought you should know, because our press doesn't understand it. I'm not even sure some of our Congress understands it. It's important to explain it. This is a dark part of our history. I called it shameful and offensive it is, but not for the reason that people cite. Oh my goodness, we only thought of slaves as 3/5 of a person. No. over half our country, the slave states, thought of them as totally worthless, as property, not as people. So it's worse than you think. Far worse than you think. Now, I'm not one who is in favor of destroying monuments and trying to rewrite our history. I mean, you can't rewrite our history unless you want to just blow up the entire Constitution and start over, and there are some people who want to do that. That's dumb. It has been an enduring document, but our history is documented right here. You can amend it all you want, and the amendment process is difficult. But we've amended it, we've corrected it, but it's still right here in black and white in our history, in our Constitution. You remove all the monuments in this country, every last one of them, and you won't solve this history. This history is our history. And it is shameful, it is offensive. It is not, I'm not arguing it's a good thing. I'm not saying suck it up and get over the monuments. I understand what it might be like to ride or walk past a monument. If your family had slaves in your lineage, and I get that, and we ought to be sensitive. We ought to write history the right way. But anyway, that's all I'm going to say about monuments. It's not a hill I want to die on. I just think it's a silly argument. And it's not silly if it's in your neighborhood and it offends you. I am sensitive to that. But we can't rewrite our history by taking down some monuments. Our history is our history. We should learn from our history. There is much to learn. These people, and I am not ever going to condone anything about slavery. So don't read that into what I'm about to say. Life was rough in these colonies. That does not excuse any bad behavior. But there was tension with the British soldiers. There was economic tension. They had dental and health issues of all kinds. And life was hard. Very hard. Much different than it is today. We are spoiled rotten today. Don't tell me you long for the good old days when you go to Colonial Williamsburg and see some of the shops. I don't think you mean that. So that's the 3/5 compromise. That's kind of a big deal, and it's important for us to understand it. So let's move on. I'm going to talk about two more things. We talked about the bicameral compromise. I want to explain the filibuster. The filibuster is a silly, you can talk all night in the Senate only, not in the House. So remember, Congress is the big body with 535 members. Senate has 100, House has 435 voting members. And the filibuster only happens in the Senate. Ted Cruz, if you think what I'm about to say is absurd, Google Ted Cruz's filibuster, and you'll see that it happens sometimes. You can fatigue the other side in an argument over legislation. You can fatigue them into submission of some kind by getting control of the Senate floor through parliamentary procedure, through procedural steps, through using the Senate's procedures. And you can then talk for hours. I believe Ted Cruz went on for 16 hours. It might have been longer. It might have been 20. He read Green Eggs and Ham from the Senate floor. It's a silly little boys club kind of maneuver that I don't like. I think you should be able to sit down at a negotiating table, have a give and take process. Have we lost all decency and the ability to talk about facts? Do we have to just rattle our sabers at each other all the time? Can we not just have civil discourse without getting shamed in social media for meeting with the other side? My goodness, the filibuster is just a joke. Don't write me and tell me how filibuster solved something in the early 1900s. Okay, it's just dumb. Well, there's another clause that was really well intended, and when we read it in class, my students actually can't believe it's there. It says, it's called the elastic clause. It's right at the end of section 8. And section 8 is the section that enumerates the powers of Congress. It starts with, section 8 starts with, the Congress shall have power to. And it goes on, lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide, and it goes on and on. And then at the end, there's a little paragraph that says, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. Did you catch that? This is also called the necessary and proper clause. We call it the elastic clause because Congress has used it again and again to stretch these powers. But notice what it said. To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper, not words I would have chosen, but okay, for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. You see, there's a doctrine, and if you've been to law school, you may or may not, depending on the quality of the school, you may or may not have learned this. You probably did. You might remember it when I say it. This doctrine that I'm about to talk about is the enumerated powers doctrine. It says Congress can't do things outside of the powers that are enumerated in the Constitution. So you get into this whole philosophical discussion about whether the Constitution is living and dead, and I'm not going to go into all that again, but it's really a matter of, does the Constitution morph naturally somehow based on the will of the people over the years without being amended, or are these powers enumerated, and do they mean something? It's really funny. I don't want to spend all day on this, but this section 8, this Congress can do whatever is necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. That language is very critical to understand. But this section 8 enumerates all the powers of Congress. They can coin money. They can punish counterfeiting. They can promote science and arts. They can establish courts and other things. They can punish piracies. They can declare war. How about that? Well, would you believe that Congress hasn't declared war in the United States? Look it up. Since World War II. How many wars have we been in? Korea. I'm probably going to forget one or two small ones, but Korea, Vietnam, the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War in Iraq, Afghanistan. I remember during the Reagan years, we had a little skirmish with Grenada, and I might be missing another one or two. Congress never voted to declare war. Yet this is a duty of Congress. And yet they allow the president, through some procedural maneuvers, to avoid declaring war, but take us to war. And if you've lost loved ones, or you see on the news, you've watched the body count or the injuries, or watched the movies about our snipers and Black Hawk Down and all the others, you know that these are costly conflicts. They're war. They involve war. And so why does Congress stretch the Constitution using the elastic clause to do some things that are outside of these enumerated powers in Section 8, but then they shirk their duty to declare war? Well, guess what? They're political. They want to get reelected. They're happy to defer to the president. And the president's happy to step in front of them and take the heat. I wouldn't want to do that if I was one person. And I think it's designed this way so that 535 people vote. I think that's what we should do before we send our young men and women into harm's way. I think it's unthinkable to do it the way that we do it, where one person makes the call. I understand the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State and the CIA and all the others and the military intelligence apparatus and all that stuff. I understand everybody weighs in. The president has lots of counselors and attorneys and all the rest. I know it's not just one person, but at the end of the day, it is one person, isn't it? Constitution doesn't contemplate that. And one more thing I'll just mention in this regard, and there's so much more to talk about here. This is such a rich topic that we're going to do our next episode on some more Constitution concepts that I think you'll enjoy. It'll be a little lighter than this one, but I happen to like the Affordable Care Act. I don't like what America's insurance companies did to us, health insurance companies did to us. And yeah, I know some of you are just fine with it and just loathe the Affordable Care Act. Well, I survived stage 3 colon cancer from almost 20 years ago now. And you know what I learned when I decided to leave banking and do my own thing and start my own company? I was told by a Florida Blue, a Blue Cross agent, representative, I was told that, well, we're going to have to do a rider that excludes your abdomen because you haven't been free of cancer for 10 years back then. And I thought, what am I going to do? Are you kidding? Oh yeah, we can't insure your entire body. So I had an incentive to go get back in a group policy somewhere and almost did so. But then along comes right at the right moment, by God's grace, the Affordable Care Act, which forces them to cover us people who have pre-existing illnesses. I haven't really cost them very much. I pay lots of high premiums and haven't, by God's grace, had health problems, and I'm thankful for that. So that's the Affordable Care Act, and it happened by stretching this Constitution. So I don't like the methodology. I could talk to you for hours about the Department of Education. If you read these enumerated powers, which we don't have time to do in this format, in Section 8 of Article 1 of the Constitution, you won't see a reference, direct or indirect, to the United States federal government being involved in education. You'll see, you know what you'll see if you read this section? The states have lots of rights. That's what you see. States' rights was a big deal. This federalism didn't take all the rights away from the states. The federal government does have the right, though, to regulate interstate commerce, and that's what they hung their hat on, in short, for the Affordable Care Act. Parts of the Affordable Care Act were shot down by the Supreme Court, but that particular element survived, and so here we are. I happen to be grateful for that particular act. I don't think I'm myopic or selfish in that regard. I think it does make sense for our country. Insurance and healthcare are complex issues. So next week, we'll talk more about the U.S. Constitution. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. It is important to know and appreciate this document. We'll talk about some of the key concepts in this document that I haven't mentioned today next week. So come back then. Please like, share, review, and subscribe to Relentless Truth. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. Go to johnwarrenmedia.com for more information. It is a blessing to be with you. I am thankful that God is on the throne, that nothing, Romans 8, nothing will separate us from him and his love, his agape, unconditional love for us. Until then.
Thanks for listening to Relentless Truth with John Warren. Please consider sharing this podcast and subscribe to receive future episodes. Connect with John regarding your comments, questions, and show ideas through johnwarrenmedia.com or at John Warren Media on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. That's all for this episode. Join us next week for another edition of Relentless Truth with John Warren.